"Stop. Don't let her touch that ring," Ava Johnson said in a voice that cut through the soft hum of the ballroom. And in an instant the entire room seemed to forget how to breathe as crystal chandeliers shimmered above polished marble floors, and every guest turned toward the small girl standing near the edge of the engagement stage, her hands tightly gripping the strap of a worn school bag, like it was the only thing keeping her grounded in a place that did not belong to her. William Carter, a billionaire known for controlling every space he entered without raising his voice, paused mid-motion with a velvet ring box held carefully in his hand, his expression shifting from calm certainty to something unreadable as his eyes followed the direction of the girl's steady finger. Evelyn Brooks, standing beside him in a perfectly tailored ivory gown, let out a soft, rehearsed laugh that sounded polished on the surface but fragile underneath, as if she had already decided how this moment was supposed to end before it even began. Ava did not move. Her dark eyes stayed locked on the ring with a focus too intense for her age, as if she was not looking at jewelry, but at something alive beneath it, something only she could see. The air in the room tightened in a quiet way, not chaotic, not loud, but heavy, like the pressure before a storm breaks, when even silence feels intentional. Margaret Hayes, the Carter family's longtime house manager, stood near the back of the ballroom holding a tray of untouched champagne, her posture perfectly straight, but her gaze flickering just a fraction too quickly toward Evelyn before dropping away again. William finally lowered the ring box slightly, studying Ava now instead of the guests, as if recalculating something he had already decided was simple. Ava took one small step forward, her shoes barely making a sound against the marble, but in that soundless moment it felt louder than anything else in the room, and she repeated, softer but sharper, "That ring isn't hers." A ripple moved through the guests, not quite shock, not quite disbelief, but something more uncomfortable, the kind of reaction people have when a story they believe starts to fracture in real time. Evelyn placed a hand lightly against her chest, her smile tightening just enough to reveal strain beneath the elegance, and she said gently, as if speaking to calm a misunderstanding that had already gone too far, "She's just a child, William. She doesn't understand what she's seeing." But Ava did not look at Evelyn. She did not blink. Her focus remained fixed on the ring, and in that unwavering attention something in the atmosphere began to shift in a way no one fully understood yet. William looked down again, slowly, at the ring resting inside the velvet box, the diamond catching the chandelier light in a way that suddenly felt less like beauty and more like precision, too deliberate, too exact, as if it had been placed rather than chosen. For the first time since he had entered the room, he hesitated. The music that had once filled the ballroom had already faded into silence without anyone noticing when it stopped, leaving behind a kind of acoustic emptiness where every breath, every movement, felt amplified. Ava noticed everything in that silence. The way Evelyn's fingers pressed too firmly into her clutch, the way Margaret Hayes stood too still for someone who had worked in this house for years, the way William's grip on the ring box shifted almost imperceptibly, as if it no longer felt familiar in his hand. Ava's voice came again, steadier now, not louder, but certain in a way that did not ask permission. "That ring was switched before you walked in here." The words did not land like an accusation. They landed like something unavoidable, something that could not be unheard once spoken. A few guests exchanged glances, unsure whether they had just heard a child's imagination or the beginning of something they should have been paying attention to all along. William's eyes moved slowly from Ava to Evelyn, not harsh, not accusing, but searching, like a man trying to find the missing piece of a decision that suddenly no longer fit together. Evelyn's smile held for half a second longer, then tightened again, the edges of it starting to strain in a way only someone close enough could notice. Ava stood completely still in the center of it all, small in size but not in presence, as if the room had unknowingly shifted its weight toward her without permission. Above them, the chandelier light fractured into small reflections across the polished floor, scattering like fragments of certainty breaking apart. William Carter slowly closed the ring box, just slightly, not fully, not decisively, but enough to signal that something had changed, even if he was not ready to name it yet. And in that suspended moment, where no one spoke and no one moved, the truth did not announce itself loudly or dramatically. It simply existed, waiting for someone brave enough to confirm it, carried quietly by a little girl who had seen something everyone else had chosen not to notice. The silence in the ballroom did not break immediately. It stretched, fragile and uncertain, as if the entire room was waiting for permission to breathe again. William Carter finally lowered the ring box completely, setting it into his palm with a controlled motion that betrayed none of the hesitation now forming behind his eyes. Evelyn Brooks shifted her weight slightly, her posture still perfect, but her fingers tightening around her clutch just enough to reveal that something about the moment no longer belonged to her control. Ava Johnson remained exactly where she stood, small against the vast marble floor, her gaze still fixed on the ring as though she could see through its polished surface into the story it was hiding. William's voice, when it came, was calm but lower than before. That is a serious claim for a child to make. A few guests exchanged uncertain looks, their earlier amusement fading into quiet curiosity. Evelyn immediately stepped closer to William, her tone soft and reassuring, almost practiced. She is overwhelmed by all of this. Children imagine things when they feel out of place in situations like these. Ava finally looked up, her expression unchanged, not defensive, not emotional, only certain, and she said clearly that she was not imagining it. The ring was not hers when it arrived in this room. A subtle shift moved through the crowd again, smaller this time, but more focused, as people began to study Evelyn in a way they had not done before. Margaret Hayes, still standing near the back, adjusted the tray in her hands, though no one was taking champagne anymore. William turned the ring box slightly in his hand, his attention narrowing now not on Ava but on the object itself, as if seeing it for the first time instead of the last step of a decision he thought he had already made. Evelyn let out a light breath of laughter, but it carried less confidence now. "William, this is absurd," she said gently, but there was a thin edge beneath the words. "You know where that ring came from." Ava took another step forward, closer now to the stage, and for the first time the guests noticed how steady she was despite her size, how she did not look around for approval or validation, as if she did not need anyone in the room to agree with her in order for what she saw to be real. She pointed again, not at Evelyn this time, but at the ring itself. "There is a mark inside the band," she said quietly, "and it is not the one that belongs to this house." A few heads turned instinctively toward William, waiting for him to dismiss her, to end the tension with a simple explanation, but he did not. Instead, he looked down at the ring again, more slowly this time, and something subtle changed in his expression, not shock yet, but recognition of inconsistency, the kind that only appears when certainty begins to loosen at the edges. Evelyn noticed it immediately. Her smile did not disappear, but it stopped reaching her eyes. "That is enough," she said softly, but her voice carried a new urgency, as if trying to close a door that had already started to open. "This is my engagement. This is not a debate." Ava did not react to the words. She simply watched William, as if the entire room had narrowed down to his next decision. Margaret Hayes shifted again at the back of the room, her gaze now fully lowered, her presence suddenly feeling heavier in a way no one could explain. William finally spoke again, slower this time, asking not Ava but Evelyn where the ring had been kept before the ceremony. The question landed differently than anything before it, not accusatory, but precise. Evelyn hesitated for the first time, just a fraction too long, and that hesitation was enough to change the temperature in the room. Ava noticed it. The guests noticed it. William noticed it. The ring was no longer just a symbol of celebration. It had become an object under examination, something that carried a question no one had fully prepared to answer. The chandeliers above continued to glow steadily, indifferent to the shift happening below, while the reflections on the marble floor seemed sharper, almost fractured, as if even light itself was reacting to uncertainty. Ava's voice softened, but it did not lose its certainty. "If you look closely, you will see it does not belong here," she said, and for the first time no one immediately responded to dismiss her. William held the ring a little higher, studying it now with full attention, and the room around him waited, suspended in a silence that had transformed from confusion into anticipation, because something about the way the child spoke no longer felt like interruption. It felt like the beginning of something that could not be ignored much longer. William Carter continued to hold the ring slightly elevated now, his eyes narrowing as if the object in his hand had changed its meaning without physically changing at all. The ballroom, once filled with controlled celebration and polite anticipation, now felt like a suspended chamber of attention where every breath seemed measured against uncertainty. Ava Johnson did not move from her position, but her focus sharpened as she watched William's expression shift from examination into something closer to doubt. Evelyn Brooks stepped half a pace forward again, her voice softer now, carefully shaped to sound calm, but the edge beneath it was no longer fully hidden. "William, this is becoming ridiculous," she said, but her words lacked the earlier ease. "It is my ring, and this ceremony is scheduled to continue." William did not respond immediately. Instead, he turned the ring slowly between his fingers, bringing it closer to the light of the chandelier above, and in doing so, something subtle became visible to him, a detail too small for the room, but significant enough to change the rhythm of his breathing. Ava noticed the change in his stillness and spoke again, not louder, not emotional, but precise. "Look inside the band," she said. "The engraving is not consistent with the Carter family registry." A faint murmur moved through the guests as people leaned in slightly, uncertain whether they were witnessing imagination or something closer to revelation. Margaret Hayes, standing at the rear of the ballroom, lowered her gaze further, her grip tightening slightly on the tray she still held, though no one had taken anything from it in some time. William's thumb moved across the inside of the ring band now, slower, more deliberate, and for the first time a trace of confusion crossed his face. Evelyn's composure began to fracture in small increments, her smile holding only by habit rather than intention. "That is not possible," she said quickly, her tone sharper now, but it carried less authority than before. William did not look at her. He simply continued examining the ring, and then paused for a moment that felt heavier than everything that had come before it. Ava took a small breath, steady but visible, and added one more detail, her voice unwavering. "It was switched before the presentation," she said. "Not after. Before." The word "before" seemed to settle into the space between everyone, reshaping the timeline of the entire moment. William slowly lowered the ring closer to eye level again, now fully focused, and as he rotated it once more, he saw it. A small deviation in the engraving pattern that did not align with what he knew had been commissioned. The realization did not arrive as shock, but as correction, like a misplaced piece finally being seen for what it was. Evelyn's eyes flickered toward Margaret Hayes for the briefest moment, then away again, too quickly for most to notice, but not for Ava, who had been watching everything since the beginning. The guests began to shift uneasily, some exchanging quiet whispers, others simply watching William for a reaction that had not yet fully formed. William finally spoke again, but this time his voice was quieter, more controlled, and directed not at Ava or Evelyn, but at the space itself, as if trying to stabilize the reality of what he was seeing. "How did this happen?" he said, not as an accusation, but as a question that required truth rather than defense. The ballroom seemed to contract around that question. Evelyn stepped closer again, her voice rising slightly, insisting that there must be a mistake, that the ring had never left her possession, that everything had been verified. But her words no longer carried the same weight in the room. Ava remained still, her eyes fixed on William, not seeking approval, only acknowledgement. Margaret Hayes finally shifted her stance at the back, her tray lowering slightly, as if the act of holding it had become unnecessary. William looked up slowly from the ring, his gaze moving across Evelyn, then briefly toward Margaret, and finally back to Ava. As if the entire room had narrowed into a single line of truth he was now forced to follow. The silence that followed was no longer passive. It was expectant, charged with the realization that whatever came next would no longer be about ceremony or appearance, but about what was real and what had been placed in front of them as a substitute. Ava spoke one last time in that moment, her voice calm and steady, carrying no triumph, only certainty. "It is not too late to see it correctly," she said, and the words settled into the room like the final piece of a puzzle clicking into place. The tension inside the ballroom shifted again, no longer floating in uncertainty, but tightening into something more focused, as if every person present had begun to understand that the moment they were witnessing could no longer be dismissed as misunderstanding. William Carter stood still with the ring held between his fingers, his gaze no longer moving quickly but settling into a deeper, more deliberate inspection. Evelyn Brooks remained close to him, but her posture had changed in subtle ways, her shoulders slightly less relaxed, her breathing less controlled, as though the stability she had maintained from the beginning was now being tested from within. Ava Johnson did not step back or forward. She simply remained in place, her presence quiet but undeniable, as if she had become the point around which everything else was now. Turning, William finally spoke, his voice measured but no longer purely formal. "I want everyone to remain calm," he said, though the words felt less like instruction and more like an attempt to steady the atmosphere itself. The guests shifted slightly, their attention locked between him, Evelyn, and the small girl who had spoken with such certainty. Evelyn turned toward William immediately, her voice now carrying a sharper edge, no longer fully softened by composure. "William, this is going too far," she said, her tone still controlled but no longer warm. "You are allowing a child to create doubt in something that has already been confirmed." Ava did not react to the statement. Instead, her eyes remained fixed on William, waiting not for agreement but for observation. William slowly lifted his gaze from the ring to Evelyn, and for the first time, there was something different in his expression, not anger, not accusation, but recalibration. He spoke carefully. "The engraving inside the band does not match the documentation I approved," he said. Evelyn's expression tightened instantly, but she responded too quickly, as if trying to outrun the question itself. "That is impossible," she said. "It came directly from the jeweler I personally selected." Margaret Hayes, still standing near the back of the ballroom, finally shifted her position more noticeably, stepping half a pace forward before stopping again, her eyes lowered but her attention fully engaged. Ava noticed that movement immediately, her gaze flicking toward Margaret for just a brief moment before returning to William. The room felt increasingly compressed, like distance itself was shrinking between the 3 points of tension. William turned the ring again, slower now, and then spoke in a quieter voice. "When was the ring last out of your possession, Evelyn?" The question was not loud, but it carried weight, and for the first time, Evelyn did not answer immediately. The pause lasted only a few seconds, but in that silence something in the room shifted irreversibly. Evelyn finally responded, her tone firm but slightly strained. "It has never left my possession until this ceremony," she said, but the certainty in her voice no longer aligned with her expression. Ava stepped forward just one small step, not dramatic, but enough to signal that she was no longer merely observing from distance. William noticed it, and so did several guests, whose attention now followed her movement instinctively. Ava spoke again, calm and precise. "That is not consistent with what I saw," she said. "The ring was not prepared with you. It was placed after." A subtle ripple of uncertainty passed through the guests again, this time deeper, more uneasy, as people began to realize that the conversation had moved beyond interpretation and into contradiction. William's eyes narrowed slightly, not at Ava, but at the timeline forming in his mind. He looked briefly toward Margaret Hayes again, and this time Margaret did not look away quickly enough. The moment of eye contact was brief, but it changed the air in the room. Evelyn noticed it too, and her composure tightened further, her voice rising slightly as she tried to regain control of the situation. "This is becoming speculation," she said. "There are procedures, approvals, security protocols. Nothing here supports what is being implied." William did not respond immediately. Instead, he lowered the ring slightly, as if weighing its physical reality against the narrative forming around it. The ballroom felt still, not frozen, but suspended in anticipation of what would come next. Ava remained calm, her expression unchanged, her presence steady in a way that contrasted sharply with the unraveling tension around her. William finally spoke again, more quietly than before, and this time his voice carried something closer to certainty forming from doubt. "Then we verify it," he said. William Carter's voice lingered in the air for a moment after he spoke, the word verify settling into the ballroom like a final line drawn across uncertainty. The guests instinctively shifted their attention toward him, sensing that the situation had moved beyond speculation and into action. Evelyn Brooks remained still for half a second too long, her expression holding steady only by effort, as if she were recalculating every possible outcome in real time. Ava Johnson did not move, but her focus sharpened, watching not the reactions around her, but the decisions forming in William's mind. William slowly lowered the ring into its velvet box, not closing it yet, but no longer displaying it, signaling that the object itself was now under question rather than celebration. He turned slightly toward Margaret Hayes, his assistant standing near the back of the ballroom, and his voice shifted into something more controlled, more procedural. "Bring me the original documentation and the registry confirmation for this piece," he said. Margaret hesitated for only a fraction of a second before nodding and stepping away, her movements careful, measured, and unusually quiet for someone who had been present in this household for years. Evelyn immediately stepped forward, her tone sharpening again as she attempted to reassert control over the moment. "William, there is no need for this escalation," she said. "Everything was handled through certified channels. You are allowing a child's assumption to disrupt a verified process." Ava's gaze moved briefly toward Evelyn, then back to William, without any emotional reaction, as if she had already separated truth from defense long before anyone else in the room had begun to consider it. William did not respond to Evelyn directly. Instead, he looked toward Ava for the first time in a way that acknowledged her not as interruption, but as participant in something unresolved. "Where did you see the switch occur?" he asked calmly. Ava did not hesitate. Before the presentation table was set, she said, "Near the preparation room." A staff member placed a case down and left it unattended for a moment. The ballroom grew quieter again, the shift in attention now more focused, as several guests subtly turned their heads toward the side corridor that led behind the main hall. Evelyn's expression tightened further, but she quickly responded, her voice now more defensive than composed. "That is not possible," she said. "There are security protocols for all preparation items. Nothing is left unattended." William raised a hand slightly, not to silence her, but to slow the pace of the exchange. He was no longer reacting emotionally. Instead, he was moving through the situation step by step, as if reconstructing a sequence of events. Ava remained steady, her presence unchanged, but her eyes followed William as he processed each detail. Margaret returned moments later carrying a tablet and a sealed folder, her footsteps quiet against the marble floor. She approached William and handed both items to him without speaking. William opened the folder first, scanning the documents quickly, his expression tightening slightly as he compared details on the page with the ring still resting in its box. Evelyn watched him closely now, her earlier confidence replaced by something more fragile, though she still attempted to maintain composure. "This is unnecessary," she repeated, but the repetition itself no longer carried conviction. William did not answer immediately. Instead, he turned the tablet on and navigated to a record log, his eyes scanning line by line. The ballroom remained silent except for the faint sound of movement from the guests shifting their weight in anticipation. Ava took one small step closer again, not interrupting, but observing. William paused on a specific entry, his expression changing subtly as he compared timestamps. He looked up slowly, first at the documentation, then toward the corridor Ava had mentioned, and finally at Margaret. The silence stretched again, longer this time, heavier. Evelyn's voice softened slightly as she tried once more to regain control of the moment. "William, whatever this is, it is being misinterpreted," she said. But William did not look at her this time. Instead, he closed the folder slowly, placed the tablet on the table beside him, and turned his attention fully toward the preparation corridor. Ava's gaze followed his without hesitation. The atmosphere in the ballroom shifted again, no longer centered on doubt or defense, but on the expectation of confirmation. William finally spoke, his voice steady but no longer uncertain. "I want to see the preparation room," he said. The request to see the preparation room did not create confusion, only a quiet confirmation that the moment had fully shifted from discussion into verification. William Carter moved first. Stepping away from the main stage with controlled precision, the velvet ring box now closed in his hand but no longer treated as a symbol of certainty. Ava Johnson followed a few steps behind him, her small frame moving calmly through the aisle between tables filled with silent guests, while Evelyn Brooks walked beside William, her posture still upright, but noticeably tighter, as if each step required more effort to maintain composure. Margaret Hayes led the way toward the side corridor, her pace measured, her expression unreadable, holding the tablet close as though it contained instructions rather than records. The corridor behind the ballroom was quieter, the sound of music and chatter fading quickly into a controlled silence that felt heavier in contrast. The lighting changed from warm chandelier glow to softer overhead fixtures, revealing polished walls and secure doors labeled with preparation access notices. Ava observed everything without speaking, her attention moving from door markings to staff movement patterns, as if she was reconstructing a sequence only she had seen begin. William slowed slightly as they approached the preparation room entrance, where a small workstation was set up with labeled trays and storage cases. He looked toward Margaret first. "Open the log for this section," he said. Margaret hesitated only briefly before unlocking the tablet and bringing up a time-stamped record. William studied it closely, his eyes moving line by line, while Evelyn stepped slightly closer, attempting to remain within control of the narrative. "This room follows strict access protocol," she said again, her voice softer now, but still deliberate. "No item enters or leaves without registration confirmation." Ava stopped just before the doorway and looked inside. The preparation room was organized but not fully settled, as if it had been active earlier but recently cleared. On one of the central tables, a small velvet case identical in structure to the one William had seen earlier sat partially open, its interior empty. William's gaze shifted immediately to it. Margaret's hand tightened slightly on the tablet. "That case was logged earlier this afternoon," she said, quietly, but her voice carried a subtle uncertainty now, as if she was noticing something she had previously accepted without question. William stepped into the room fully, scanning the surfaces. Ava followed at the threshold but did not enter completely, watching carefully. Evelyn remained at the doorway, her presence now less anchored, her confidence thinning in visible increments. William picked up the empty case, examining its interior, then turned it slowly in his hand. There were no markings inconsistent with official documentation, but the absence of the expected contents created a contradiction that could not be ignored. Ava spoke softly from the doorway. "That is not the case I saw earlier," she said. "It had a seal when it was placed down." A brief silence followed, not dramatic, but precise, as William processed the statement against the log on the tablet. He looked up at Margaret again. "Was there any moment this afternoon where the preparation area was unattended?" he asked. Margaret paused longer this time before answering, her eyes lowering slightly. "There was a brief overlap during transfer between staging and final setup," she said carefully. 2 minutes. Evelyn immediately responded, her tone sharper again, attempting to redirect the interpretation. "That is standard timing variation in any large event," she said. "Nothing within that window explains what is being implied." But William did not look at her. Instead, he placed the empty case back down and walked slowly along the preparation table, his attention narrowing on small details that had previously gone unnoticed. Ava stepped one small pace into the room now, no longer just observing from outside, her eyes following William's movement with quiet certainty. She pointed gently toward a side shelf where additional storage containers were aligned. "That shelf was not checked when I first saw the change," she said. Margaret looked toward the shelf immediately, then back to her tablet, then back again, her expression tightening slightly as she verified internal logs. William moved toward the shelf and opened one of the containers. Inside, instead of expected ceremonial materials, there was a second sealed case, similar but not identical in labeling structure. The difference was subtle but visible once examined closely. Evelyn's breathing changed slightly, though she tried to maintain composure. "That is not part of our inventory system," she said quickly, but her voice no longer carried full control. William did not respond immediately. He simply held the second case, then looked back toward Ava. The room felt narrower now, as if the truth had moved from possibility into physical presence. Ava remained calm, her expression unchanged, and said quietly, "It was never in the correct place to begin with." William stood still for a long moment, looking at both cases, the documentation on the tablet, and the shifting behavior of everyone present. The silence that followed was no longer uncertainty. It was recognition that something within the system had already changed before anyone in the room had understood it. And in that realization, William's voice finally lowered, steady but absolute, as he said, "Bring everything back to the main hall." The instruction to bring everything back to the main hall changed the entire direction of the moment, not through force, but through clarity, as if William Carter had finally decided that uncertainty could no longer remain confined in a closed room. The preparation area, once the center of hidden contradiction, now felt like only the starting point of something that needed to be seen in full context. William stepped out first, holding both the original case and the secondary container, his expression controlled but no longer passive. Ava Johnson followed closely behind him, her small step steady, her gaze forward, as if she already understood that truth did not remain stable until it was fully exposed. Evelyn Brooks walked slightly behind William now, her earlier composure visibly strained, her movements still elegant but no longer effortless, as if every step required deliberate maintenance of appearance. Margaret Hayes moved with them as well, tablet still in hand, but now less certain in her posture, her eyes occasionally flicking between the documents and the items William carried. The corridor back to the ballroom felt longer on. The return, not in distance but in perception, as though the weight of what had been discovered was expanding the space between each step. When they re-entered the main hall, the atmosphere shifted immediately. Guests who had remained in place turned toward the group, sensing the change in energy before any words were spoken. The ballroom, once suspended in uncertainty, now carried anticipation sharpened by the return of physical evidence. William did not proceed to the stage immediately. Instead, he stopped at the center of the room, placing both containers on a nearby presentation table with deliberate control. Ava stood slightly to his right, maintaining her position without hesitation. Evelyn remained near him, but no longer fully within his direct alignment. Margaret took a position slightly behind, still holding the tablet, though her attention now alternated between the screen and the objects on the table. William looked at the guests briefly, then spoke in a steady voice that carried through the hall without needing force. "We have verified the preparation records and physical storage," he said. A quiet ripple moved through the room, people adjusting their posture as attention intensified. Evelyn immediately responded, stepping half a pace forward, her voice carefully measured but clearly under pressure. "William, this is being interpreted out of context," she said. "There are procedural explanations for every variation in timing and handling." Ava did not react to Evelyn's statement. Her eyes remained focused on William and the containers. William raised one of them slightly, showing it to the room. "This case was not present in the official registry at the time of staging," he said calmly. "The second container does not match any approved listing." The words settled into the room with immediate weight. Several guests leaned forward slightly, attention sharpening as the situation moved from suspicion into confirmation of inconsistency. Evelyn's expression tightened further, and for the first time her voice carried a noticeable strain. "That is not possible," she said. "Everything passed through authorized channels." Margaret Hayes stepped forward slightly, as if preparing to speak, then paused, glancing at the tablet before lowering her gaze again. William turned the second container in his hand, then looked directly at Evelyn. "Was this item ever in your direct control before it arrived in this room?" he asked. The question was simple, but its effect was immediate. Evelyn hesitated, just long enough to be noticeable to everyone paying attention. That hesitation changed the atmosphere more than any statement could have. Ava took a small step forward now, still calm, and spoke with quiet certainty. "It was switched during the transition window," she said again, reinforcing what had already been stated earlier. William did not dismiss her this time. Instead, he looked back at Margaret. "Confirm the exact timing overlap," he said. Margaret's fingers moved across the tablet, scanning logs with visible focus. After a moment, she spoke quietly. "There was a 2-minute unmonitored transfer between staging and final presentation," she said. Evelyn immediately reacted, her voice rising slightly as she tried to regain narrative control. "That is standard operational overlap," she said. "It does not indicate any irregularity." But William no longer responded to defensive framing. He placed the containers down side by side on the table and stepped back slightly, allowing the evidence to stand on its own. The ballroom had become fully silent now, with no background noise of conversation, only focused attention directed toward the center of the room. Ava remained still, watching William, not expecting conclusion but recognition. William finally spoke again, his voice steady, lower, and fully resolved. "Then we identify exactly what entered this room during that window," he said. The ballroom had fully transformed into a space of complete attention, where every guest now understood that what they were witnessing was no longer a misunderstanding of timing or procedure, but a structural contradiction that demanded resolution. William Carter stood at the center of the hall with both containers placed on the table in front of him, his posture controlled, his focus absolute, as if every detail of the room had narrowed into a single point of truth he was now committed to uncovering. Ava Johnson remained at his side, small in presence but steady in attention, her eyes fixed not on the crowd but on the objects that had shifted the entire trajectory of the evening. Evelyn Brooks stood slightly apart now, her composure still intact on the surface, but her breathing less even. Her expression tightened in a way that no longer matched the elegance she had maintained earlier. Margaret Hayes remained behind William's right shoulder, tablet in hand, her gaze lowered but alert, as if the data she held had become heavier with implication. William looked at the guests briefly, then spoke in a calm but fully resolved tone. "We will determine exactly what entered this room during the unmonitored interval," he said. A quiet ripple moved through the audience, not of confusion now, but of expectation. Evelyn stepped forward immediately, her voice sharper, more urgent, as she attempted to regain control of interpretation. "William, this is escalating beyond reason," she said. "A procedural gap does not equate to tampering or substitution." Ava did not look at her. Her attention remained on William and the containers, as if she already knew the outcome would not depend on argument. William did not respond to Evelyn directly this time. Instead, he turned slightly toward Margaret, cross-referenced the staging camera logs with entry records for the preparation corridor, he said. Margaret nodded and immediately brought the tablet up, navigating through recorded timestamps. The ballroom remained silent except for the faint sound of movement from guests adjusting their focus, all eyes now locked on the center table. Evelyn's expression tightened further, but she remained still, as if forcing stability through restraint. Ava took a small step closer to the table, still not touching anything, but positioning herself where she could see both containers clearly. William opened the first case again, then the second, comparing them side by side. The difference was subtle but no longer dismissible. Labeling structure, internal placement, and registry alignment did not correspond. Margaret's voice broke the silence after a moment, careful but precise. "There is a discrepancy in the recorded sequence," she said. "The preparation room feed shows a brief interruption during transfer authorization. That interruption overlaps with the window identified earlier." A soft murmur moved through the room as guests processed the implication. Evelyn immediately responded, her voice controlled but now visibly strained. "Temporary signal interruption is not evidence of substitution," she said. "It is a technical issue, nothing more." William finally looked at her directly, and this time his expression carried no uncertainty, only measured clarity. "Then it should be easy to resolve," he said. "Show me the uninterrupted sequence before and after the gap." Margaret adjusted the tablet and attempted to isolate the continuous feed, her movements more deliberate now. A moment passed, then another, as the data loaded. The ballroom felt compressed, the silence no longer passive but concentrated, as if every person present was waiting for a single confirmation or denial that would define the entire situation. Ava remained still, her gaze unwavering, her presence calm in contrast to the rising tension around her. Evelyn's posture remained upright, but her hands tightened slightly at her sides, a detail only visible to those closest to her position. The feed appeared on the tablet, and Margaret studied it closely. After several seconds, she spoke again, more quietly this time. "The interruption was not logged as system failure," she said. "It was manually initiated from internal access." A shift moved through the room immediately, not loud, but absolute in its effect. William did not react dramatically. Instead, he placed one hand on the edge of the table, steadying the physical reality in front of him, and looked at both containers again. Ava finally spoke, her voice calm and direct. "That is when the switch occurred," she said. "Not during staging, but during the manual override." Evelyn's face tightened further, her control visibly eroding under the weight of converging details. William did not look at her now. Instead, he turned slightly toward Margaret. "Identify the origin of the manual override," he said. Margaret hesitated for a fraction longer than before, then focused on the tablet again, her expression changing subtly as she traced the access signature. The ballroom held its breath as she prepared to respond, and in that moment, every presence in the room understood that the next confirmation would no longer be interpretive, but definitive. The ballroom remained frozen in a state of complete anticipation as Margaret Hayes continued to analyze the tablet, her eyes moving more slowly now, as if each line of data carried increasing weight. William Carter stood perfectly still beside the table, both containers untouched now, his attention fully anchored to the unfolding verification rather than the ceremony that had once defined the evening. Ava Johnson remained at his side, her calm presence unchanged, her gaze steady, not searching for validation, but observing the final alignment of facts she had already spoken aloud. Evelyn Brooks stood slightly apart, her posture still upright, but now visibly strained in a way that could no longer be concealed through elegance or composure alone. The guests in the ballroom did not speak. Instead, they watched in a collective silence that had shifted from curiosity into expectation of resolution. Margaret finally spoke, her voice low and careful, as she read from the access log. "The manual override originated from an internal authorized credential," she said. The room did not react immediately, as if waiting for clarification that might soften the meaning of the statement. William's expression remained steady, but his focus sharpened. "Identify the credential holder," he said. Margaret hesitated for a brief moment, her fingers pausing on the tablet screen before continuing. "The access was registered under secondary administrative authorization linked to preparation oversight," she said. A subtle shift moved through the room as guests began to process the implication of internal involvement rather than external error. Evelyn's expression tightened instantly, and for the first time her composure fractured into visible tension. "That is not accurate," she said quickly. "Those credentials are restricted and cannot be used without dual confirmation." Ava stepped slightly forward, still calm, still controlled, her voice entering the silence without force but with precision. "It was used during the transfer window," she said again, reinforcing the timeline that had already been established. William turned slowly toward Margaret, his voice now quieter but fully resolved. "Confirm the exact identity tied to the override," he said. The ballroom seemed to contract further, as if every person present had unconsciously leaned toward the answer before it was spoken. Margaret studied the final line on the screen, her expression shifting subtly before she spoke. "The override was executed using authorization linked to Evelyn Brooks," she said. The words did not echo. They simply settled. No reaction came immediately from the guests, only a stillness that felt heavier than any noise. Evelyn did not move at first. Her face remained composed for a fraction of a second, as if attempting to hold the structure of the moment together through sheer will. Then, slowly, the tension in her expression shifted, revealing the collapse beneath the surface. William did not speak immediately. Instead, he looked at Evelyn directly, not with anger, but with the clarity of understanding that no longer required speculation. Ava remained still, her attention steady, as if the confirmation only completed what she had already observed rather than revealed something new. The guests began to react in small movements, subtle shifts of posture, quiet exchanges of disbelief that remained restrained by the weight of the moment. Margaret lowered the tablet slightly, her role in the process now complete, her expression neutral but distant. Evelyn finally broke her silence, her voice lower now, lacking its earlier control. "William," she began, but stopped briefly, as if searching for a version of the situation that could still be redirected. "I can explain the procedural context." William raised a hand slightly, not sharply, but enough to stop further continuation. "No explanation is needed at this stage," he said calmly. "The truth of the process is already clear." Evelyn's gaze moved briefly toward Ava, then back to William, but there was no longer stability in her posture. Ava did not respond to the glance. She simply remained present, her role unchanged, her certainty unaffected by the shift around her. William turned slightly toward the room now, his voice steady as he addressed the final state of the situation. The ring and all associated items will remain under verification until full procedural review is complete, he said. The ballroom remained silent, absorbing the finality of the statement. Evelyn stood motionless now, no longer attempting to speak, as the structure she had maintained throughout the evening dissolved into resolution. Ava looked up briefly at William, not with triumph, but with quiet confirmation, as if the truth had simply reached its necessary conclusion. And in that final stillness, the room understood that the moment had fully changed, not through confrontation, but through undeniable clarity.